I'm just going to open some images and adjust them. And we'll refine a few images. So we always start in Camera Raw, optimize the picture, get as much out of it as you possibly can. And you can use the adjustment brush if you need to work on isolated areas, like I showed you before in here. But there's only so much you can do with that, because the masking ability is relatively crude. So when I find I'm getting too frustrated here in Camera Raw to do something precisely, I open it all the way into Photoshop, and now I'm going to start piling adjustment layers on top of it. I have no plan for this image. I'm just going to do whatever comes naturally to me. And in the process, we'll see if we can get it refined. Now, when I look at this image, I see these two buildings in the front, and that's really why I picked up the camera. There's these two unique looking buildings. What's in the distance, where all the other buildings are, to me is more of a distraction. That's pulling your attention away from the buildings that are in the foreground that I really want you to be looking at more. So that's what I'm thinking about. One way I could do this is I'm going to come in here and think about doing an adjustment layer. The kind I'm going to use is called Hue Saturation. And in there, one of the sliders we have available is saturation. And saturation means how colorful is the picture. If I turn this up, it will become more colorful. It will look ridiculous after a while. If I bring it down, it'll become less colorful. And if I bring it all the way to the left, it'll become black and white. So what I'm going to do is look at the area that's beyond the two buildings that I'm interested in. It's the city beyond. And I'm going to bring saturation all the way down. I'll slowly bring it up, and I'll say, what is the lowest setting I could get away with without somebody saying, you applied this hue and saturation adjustment to that. Instead, they might not know I did it. So I'm going to say about -30, right around there. They might not say, oh, it's so obvious you did this. Then this little panel where my adjustment is actually attached to this icon that's over on the side. It's a pop-out little panel right now. If you click on this icon, it would go away. And if you click on the icon again, it would pop open. Or if I double-clicked on that icon on the left side of the adjustment, that represents the adjustment layer, that would cause it to pop open as well. It's not always that way. You can actually drag its name, the word properties, like this, to separate it, where it would always be there. But if you dragged its name so it's over near one of those little icon things, it might be that way. I think that's the default. But I'm just going to close that to get it out of the way. Now we have our adjustment. If I turn off the eyeball, you'll see what the image used to look like. You see it's more colorful. I turn it back on, and you'll see it's less colorful. Now if I do that and I think about where would I not want that to happen? Well, I want the two buildings in the foreground. Don't want it to happen there. Also, I don't like the sky when it happens. So what I'm going to do is I could paint over the sky with black to say don't apply here, remove adjustment from here, and paint over the buildings. But I don't look forward to painting on that tower that's going up there towards the top. But let's try it. I'm going to grab my brush, and right now it's giving me a no symbol. Can you see my mouse? It looks like a no symbol. If you zoom up. The reason for that is look at what's active in my layers panel. I clicked around enough where if you see where the square brackets are that highlight what's active, it's not the mask. This represents the adjustment. You can't paint on that. It's an adjustment. It's not a picture. It can't contain paint, but this can. So if it ever shows you a no symbol when you're working on an adjustment layer, it means the thing that can be painted on isn't active. And so just glance in your layers panel. Make sure it's on that mask. Now I'm going to grab my brush. I'm using the square bracket keys to make it larger. And I'm going to paint across the sky. And when I do, if I paint with black, that is, it's going to remove my adjustment and bring the image back to the way it used to look. And so I'll paint all the way across the sky to bring back the color. If you look in my layers panel, you can see the black here, and it means whatever's in this layer is being hidden up there. Then I'll get a smaller brush. And I'll come in here and paint down part of this building to say, do not affect this building. And as I do, it goes back to how colorful it used to be. I'll do the same thing to the other building. And yes, I would usually be more careful. Meaning I would zoom up and I would be careful. But right now we're talking about concepts. I'm not making an image I'm going to frame. We're just talking concepts, so I'll be a little more crude than I usually would. But I'm varying the size of my brush so that right here it's not too wide, it doesn't go beyond the edges. But since it's applying to the sky already up there, I don't have to go too high. Now I can't tell where I've painted and where I haven't. Other than looking in the layers panel, I can see the black paint. But you remember how you can get a red overlay? Backslash. I can now tell where have I removed the adjustment from, and I can see if that's where it might be appropriate. If it's not, I just continue painting. I'll hit X to paint with white, get it off for that. I'll hit X to paint with black to get it on here. Get it around that side. Well, I'll get those people out front. I'll limit it to where the sidewalk is. Like that. And just see if there's any other areas where I might have needed it or where it shouldn't be. And then I hit backslash again. Now if I turn off the eyeball, here's before, here's after. Do you see how the color is now toned down in the image in a lot of areas, but not where the buildings are and not where the sky is? Now at any time after painting or at any time during this process, I can modify the adjustment. If you can have this little icon you can click on to get the properties to show up, then the properties can show you one of two things. It doesn't always show you the adjustment. The properties sometimes shows you settings related to your mask. And if that's the case, that's when you can click on the left side of that and you'll see the adjustment instead. So when you're working on a layer that contains an adjustment with a mask, that properties panel where you usually see your adjustment doesn't always just show the adjustment. If the mask is active, it actually shows you stuff related to your mask. Just stuff we haven't talked about yet. So click over here on the side that contains the adjustment. But now I could say, well, maybe I want to fine tune that, see if I can get away with it being a little less. Now let's say if I turn this off and on, look at the foreground really close to where we would be standing when taking the photograph. Do you see the green stuff that's becoming less colorful? Let's say I want that to still be less colorful, but I only want the adjustment to apply half as much. I don't want to completely remove it from there, but I want to make it half strength there. So I make sure the mask is active, and I paint with black because black is what prevents the adjustment from applying. And what I do is at the top of my screen, there's an opacity setting. I bring it down to 50%. And I didn't click on the number, I just clicked on the word opacity and I dragged. Because it's just more efficient than playing with the number of that little arrow. So now opacity means let's apply black, but let's apply it at 50% strength. So when I paint, I'll paint now over this area, let go, and then I'll paint over this area. If you look now at my mask, you see what it put in there? Put in gray. Because if white means apply normally, black means don't apply at all, then 50% gray would mean apply halfway. And so when you vary that opacity setting, it's just painting with different shades of gray in there. You could just as well leave this at 100% opacity and change your foreground color to 50% gray. Because that's all it cares about is what ends up in that mask. Now I could build up other adjustments in here. Maybe I want to make those two foreground buildings more colorful, or I want to pull out shadow detail or something like that. Well, I just come down here and I create a new adjustment. In this case, maybe I'm going to come in and use a fancy adjustment. Curves is my favorite one. Everybody else thinks that it's like old school or something, but it's the most powerful adjustment in all of Photoshop. So I'm not going to describe how to use it because we're in a 101 class. That's just too much for you guys. Just making it steeper. What you do is you click on a dark area and move it down, click on a bright area and move it up, and what you do is you add contrast. Then I'm going to paint to say where do I want this to apply or not. Here's a trick. I want this to apply to a small area in my picture. I don't feel like painting over 98% of this picture with black to say don't apply, don't apply, don't apply. So what I'm going to do instead is when that mask is active, there's a trick, you can do this. You can invert the mask. The word invert means give me the opposite. So if we have white in the mask right now, when you invert it, watch the mask, you get the opposite of white. It's as if I painted over the entire mask with black. Black means don't apply, so right now that adjustment is doing nothing. It doesn't have anywhere to apply. And now I got to grab my paintbrush tool and paint it in wherever I want it. I just need to make sure I paint with white. Imagine I was precise there. I can double click on the left side, that's where the adjustment is located, and I can see my adjustment, and I'll probably fine tune this one. Curves is not something we're going to get into much in this class, so I'm not going to be overly descriptive with it. This can be any adjustment, doesn't matter what kind. So now let's see it before. See, now I'm making that pop out a little bit. But I'd usually be much more careful with where I painted. And I'd double check my mask by hitting backslash and say, is that really the right spot and all that? And I'm not going to do that right now. So the main thing is adjust your images by using what's in this menu. Just make sure the topmost layer is active at the time you do, so they're always added on top, on top, on top. Otherwise, you can get somewhat unpredictable results. And when you're done applying that adjustment, you can paint. And when you paint with black, you remove the adjustment so it can no longer affect your image in that area. The alternative is you could make a selection before you apply the adjustment. And if you do, the selection would be converted into one of those. So I'm sure somewhere in here I have a few documents that have some adjustment layers in them. So this is what it looks like when I open up an image that may have been previously adjusted. Tomorrow we'll talk about the fact that you put your retouching below your adjustments. But here's two layers that are retouched because that's a stitched panorama and we had to fill in the missing parts so we didn't have to crop too much out. You'll learn how to do that tomorrow. Above that are a bunch of adjustment layers. If I turn off their eyeballs, this is what it looked like without them. And I'll just turn them on one at a time. This one here, you can tell by looking at the mask what part of the picture it would affect. Isn't it going to be the upper right? Because that's where the mask is white. So I turn it on, watch the upper right of the picture. You see how it's darkening that to make it look more like the rest? Then the one above that, if you look at the mask, isn't it going to affect the lower right of the picture? Because that's where it's white in the mask. So watch the lower right. See how that's getting kind of darkened? The next one up looks like it's going to affect everything because the mask is white. So I turn it on, and somewhere, everywhere in the image, something's changing. The green things are changing because there's an adjustment you could use that isolates greens. The next one, if you look at the mask, can you see that it's on the right and left side but not in the middle? So watch what happens on the right and left side but not the middle. Well, a little darkening. Then the next one up, do you see how it's white near the top left? And let's see what it does. So watch the top left-ish area. You see it making that part pop out. And then here's one called overall contrast. And just look at where the mask is black. It's not affecting a few parts on the right. Okay. So in this case, if you want to see before and after, I'll turn off all these eyeballs. There's the before. And then turn them all back on. And there's after. Build it up. And you just work on whatever you consider to be the largest problem. Tackle it first. Then reevaluate the image and say, is there any other issue? If so, whatever the biggest one is, tackle it. And keep doing that until you run out of either problems, patience, or time. Whenever one of those things you run out of is when you're done. Done with problems, you're done. Lost your patience, you can't keep going. Got no more time, you can't keep going, so you're done. And if you want to save those layers, we're going to save this in Photoshop file format or TIFF. Most of the time I'm using TIFF these days, but it's no problem to use Photoshop. In each one of those masks, you can also hit backslash to double check them when you're done. Make sure you were pretty good with your painting. Double. Because oftentimes I'm sloppy, like on this one I'm pretty sloppy, and I might just want to double check, see if there's any real issues with where they're applying. If you want to fine tune any of these adjustments, just double click on the icon on the left side of the adjustment layer. It'll pop open that little panel with your adjustment in it, and you can fine tune whatever it is. This one is zeroed out because you'd have to switch to a menu in here called yellows to see, or actually in here, to see the adjustment. So adjustment layers, you build them up, and they're nice. We have a whole bunch of adjustments. It can take years to get used to all the adjustments. So use the ones that are obvious first. Brightness and contrast only has 2 sliders, pretty easy to get used to. And then just slowly expand which ones you know about. And if at all possible, use them as adjustment layers so that when I save this image, the original image is always at the bottom untouched. And that everything I do to it is on a separate piece above it. So that at any time, if I screwed up with anything, I could throw away one piece of this without throwing away the rest, without having to start over. That's the idea. Questions on that? Adjustment layers? Anything?
Yeah, we have a question.
Right.
You said to make sure you have the most recent layer on top. If it's out of order, can you move them up? We've had a couple questions about how to just display, like earlier you showed how to just turn all the eyeballs off.
Yeah.
It's super quick, turn all of them on, and you can just drag them around, right?
Yeah, you can change the order of these by dragging them around. So if I click on the top one and drag it down and let go, it's going to move down to wherever it is I dragged it to. The end result of what's there might look different, might not. If you just think about, let's say that I have an adjustment layer that removes all the color in an image. So I do one that's called black and white. Removes all the color from my image. And then on top of that, I add another adjustment. Let's call it Hue and Saturation. Then there's a checkbox called Colorized, add color back in. And I change the hue slider to whatever color it is I want. Well, if I reverse the order of those layers, whatever's on top is considered to be applied last. And so if the very last thing that was done was to be converted to black and white, the image would look different, wouldn't it? Because it's thought of as the topmost adjustment is looking at whatever's underneath it, and the result of whatever those changes are underneath is what it's affecting. And so if you suddenly change the order of this, it can look completely different. Or if I drag the black and white way down, it might look different. And so just to keep it predictable, you always add new adjustment layers on top unless you have a very good thought out reason not to. Mm-hmm. You just don't casually say, I'm going to add an adjustment layer here. You add it on top unless you got a good reason. If you have a good reason to put it underneath some reason, go for it. Maybe my reason is, here there's a little corner of the sky that had some retouching, and there's something that is only wrong with that part. I might add an adjustment layer directly above it, and then there are some special features I could use to say, only affect that one chunk over there or something. There are reasons you would put stuff underneath, but it's only kind of alternative circumstances, not the everyday, I'm just adding another adjustment kind of thing. Anything else before we move?
I think we're good.
All right.
Do you have a question? Go ahead.
Can you apply an adjustment to just one layer and not all of them?
Yes. In fact, I wish I would have kept that image open. Isn't that what I just mentioned? Yes, you can. So let me see. I don't know that I have a multi-layered document convenient. Well, yeah, I do. I have full layout somewhere in here. I will. I wish I had one that had. Okay, here's one. Okay, this is a complex Photoshop document that is using a lot of features we haven't talked about yet. So you'll have to keep that in mind. But the main thing is there's more than one photo in it. And those photos don't affect everything. So here's a photo. If I turn off its eyeball, you see it's the top picture. I want that picture to be black and white, but I don't want the picture up here to be black and white. So if I put my adjustment layer in when the topmost layer is active, and I come over here and choose black and white. everything below it becomes black and white, because the way layers work is it's always as if I'm standing at the top of the layers palette looking down, and whatever the first thing my eyes sees is going to affect what is below that. You know, I have to look through that topmost layer before I can see what's under it. And in this case, I'm looking through the black and white layer before I can see the stuff under it, right? Now I'm going to drag this downward, and I'm going to move it so it's below the layer that contains that picture. You notice the picture went back to color? Because if I'm standing at the top of the layers palette looking down, my eyes would bump into that picture before it would bump into this black and white adjustment layer, right? If you're looking down. And so this can only affect what's below it. And so I might move this down so it's sitting directly above that other picture. And it's not affecting those layers that are up top. The problem would be, what if there's another picture of another baby over to the right side that's lower than this? If so, this would affect all the layers that are underneath it. So there's a way to make it only affect one layer, regardless of how many layers there are everywhere else. Only affect one layer. So to show you that, I'll move it back up so it's right above the picture that's at the bottom of this composition. And I want it to only affect that one layer. Well, here's how you do it. There's a couple different ways of implementing it, but in general, when the adjustment layer is active, you go to the Layer menu, and there's a choice called Create Clipping Mask. Create Clipping Mask. It's under the Layer menu. And it means make this layer only show up where there's stuff on the layer directly below. Don't make it show up anywhere else, just where there's something on that layer below. Well, that layer below doesn't fill the entire document. It's only a picture of the baby. So when I choose that, now it only affects one layer. And I can tell it's turned on that way because there's a little down pointing arrow next to it. That's what showed up when I chose that feature. And it means this only shows up where that thing is. What's weird is this particular document happens to have the arrow also on the layer below, which it usually wouldn't be there. That means this is only showing up where something else is below. That's because this picture is right now being clipped by a fancy border. The fancy border is right below. We'll learn about that in a little bit. But the other way you can do it, I'll choose Undo, is if I'm in the middle of the adjustment itself, meaning wherever the sliders are for the adjustment, you're going to see this icon right here. That does the exact same thing. So if I click it, the end result is exactly the same. It's just an icon that does the exact same thing as the menu choice. Okay? And so if that's pushed in when you're doing your adjustment, that guy, it means this adjustment only affects one layer, the one directly below it.